For those who don't know me, my name is Osamah Khalil. I'm a professor here in the history department and the organizer of today's symposium. So I want to welcome you to the event. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge with respect, as we do at all major events at Syracuse, the Onondaga Nation, the indigenous people whose ancestral lands the university is now on. I also want to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors, the Humanities Center, the Moynihan Institute, the University's Office of Research and VP of Research John Liu, the History Department, Middle Eastern Studies Program, the Asian and Asian American Studies Program, the Newhouse Center for Global Engagement, the Office of Multicultural Affairs, and Syracuse University Libraries. And I also want to thank Juanita Haran, Hava Caracas-Kellis, and Lindsay Kirshner for all their help in setting up the event. It would not have been possible without them. So just by way of a brief intro, the symposium takes a broad look at authoritarianism, both past, present, and possibly future. And as the images and reports that just played from November of 1989 demonstrate, there was immense enthusiasm in the spring and fall of 1989 that sets up our discussion today and revisiting it 30 years later. So the first part of today's symposium is going to look at how we got to these events at the Berlin Wall, what happened a little bit after. And in keeping with the theme of today's symposium, the panels will explore the stories and strategies of resistance to authoritarianism, from above as well as from below. And so I think all of our speakers will be able to talk about that. And we'll also discuss today how 30 years later there are less hopeful and more troubling signs that are emanating from Eastern and Central Europe, as well as rising tensions between the United States and China. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to, as a final note, let me also say this. This is a continuation of the U.S. and the World Workshop series, this panel in particular, which is our second here at the Maxwell School, and planning is underway for the third to be held next spring in 2020. So hopefully you'll come back and join us for that. So I'm very happy to introduce our distinguished panel who'll be helping us to explore these issues today and then transitioning to our second panel. The first is Robert Terrell, who's Assistant Professor of History in the Maxwell School. He's joining us this year. And Robert specializes in 20th century German and European history. At Syracuse, he's taught courses on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, Europe since 1945, and the history of consumption and consumerism. And his research has been funded by the J. William Fulbright Commission, the German Historical Institute, and the German Academic Exchange Service. Thank you, Robert. Jeremy Wallace is Associate Professor of Government at Cornell University, and he's specializing in authoritarianism and Chinese politics. His first book, Cities and Stability, examines urbanization, redistribution, and regime survival in China. And he's currently finishing a second book, Seeking Truth and Hiding Facts, which tackles why authoritarian regimes reform and reassessing Chinese politics from 1978 to 2018. So it's a very timely talk by Jeremy. And finally joining us is James Graham Wilson, who's a historian at the State Department, where he compiles volumes on arms control and national security for the Foreign Relations of the United States series. And he's the author of the excellent Triumph of Improvisation, Gorbachev's Adaptability, and Reagan's Engagement and the End of the Cold War, which was published by Cornell in 2014. And James received his PhD from the University of Virginia in 2011. So please join me in welcoming our guests.
Well, thank you so much, Osamah. And can everyone hear me? Yes, okay. And thanks so much also to Lindsay and Hava for all your hard work, and it's been wonderful to be here with my wife. Let me see if I can get this to work now. Whoops. Here we go. So I'd like to start off with a snapshot in time leading into the year 1989. This photograph here is from December 7th, 1988. And here you have George Bush, used to be called just George Bush, now H.W. Bush, who has just been elected president a few weeks before. He was the first sitting vice president since Martin Van Buren. He won a very contentious race, and I'm sure if Jim Steinberg were here, he could talk all about the 1988 election, but he's coming into office supremely prepared for the role, but not with somebody with a large mandate. He has a hostile Congress. When unlike his predecessor, Ronald Reagan, who had come in 1981, Bush is facing large debts, and he does not have the political capital for a large defense buildup. He's standing there a little awkwardly because he's been invited to this meet and greet session, and yet he's not yet been sworn in as president. So it's a kind of awkward moment for him. To Bush's right, figuratively and literally, is President Ronald Reagan, who's soaking this moment in, right? Reagan, who had been elected in 1981 as a fervent anti-communist, anti-Soviet hardliner, is getting what he always wanted, which is to have a Soviet leader by his side, and he's showing them America. He's showing them New York City, the Statue of Liberty in the background. And he's going out triumphant. He has, a year before, signed with Mikhail Gorbachev the December 1987 Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the first treaty ever to reduce nuclear weapons. He's hopeful that his grand idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative will lead to even further nuclear reductions, if not the complete abolition of nuclear weapons. And if I could just pause now and show the next slide. This is actually something that Reagan had said just a few weeks earlier. To Soviet Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze. One remembers Reagan saying very stridently in front of the Berlin Wall, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." He had said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." But in actually the last few weeks of 1988, he says to Gorbachev's Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze that he realized that the division of Germany and of Berlin was a product of World War II, and it was an emotional issue for the Soviet Union. And perhaps he had said too much. He had spoken too stridently when he said, "tear down this wall," and that maybe one day it would happen, but not anytime soon. Okay, that's Reagan, right at the end of 1988. It's not the same Reagan that most people, remember in terms of standing at the wall and saying, "tear down this wall." And the reason it's important, and by the way, this can be found online in the Foreign Relations of the US series at history.state.gov. But the reason I think it's important is because it shows just how out on the horizon the idea of the Berlin Wall coming down was, even to Ronald Reagan at this moment in time in December of '88. Now, to Reagan's right is Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev, earlier that day, had delivered a blockbuster speech to the United Nations in which he had announced that the Soviet Union would reduce unilaterally 500,000 troops, 10,000 tanks, and a great number of other military systems. He had called in that speech for a new world order, right? Long before that phrase entered the lexicon, this is something Gorbachev said. He talked about a common European home in Europe. He quoted Victor Hugo. But at the same time, on Gorbachev's mind was he gets in the car from the United Nations. They take him to the ferry boat to go to Governor's Island. And at that moment, he's been told of the immense devastation of the earthquake in Armenia that had happened the day before. And he decides at this moment to cut the trip short. And he and his wife, Raisa, flew back shortly after this moment. And what they found there is important, not just because of the devastation, 25,000 people were estimated to be killed, but when he was consoling the survivors, many of them accosted him for not supporting Armenia's efforts to bring into its Soviet republic the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan. Now, it's important because it's an inkling, the dark inkling of what might be to come for Gorbachev, even as he's announcing we're entering a new era, an era of democratization, of open speech. There are throughout the corners of the Soviet Empire forces who are kind of taking the lead from him. And when he's talking about more democratization, sometimes this can lead toward ethnic nationalism, fervent nationalism that might fracture the artifice that the Soviet Union has built up. And it's not necessarily the same as in Eastern Europe and Germany and Poland, as we'll hear later. But this is happening all on the same day as he's reigning triumphant, the status secured as an equal superpower. I'll just say a word then about what happens in the next few months. In January, George Bush is sworn in as president, and he has around him on his national security team some people who are a little more skeptical of Gorbachev than Reagan had been. Here's another quote from the Foreign Relations volume on Soviet Union 87-88, where then Deputy CIA Director Robert Gates laid out an analysis of Gorbachev as somebody who is actually trying to make the Soviet Union a stronger competitor to the United States. And actually, the United States has seen this happen before. The period of détente in the 1970s had allowed the Soviets to kind of give the impression that the Cold War was over, but at the same time, they continued building up a strategic advantage. Bush also has around him National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, who is very open about the fact that he did not trust Gorbachev, he did not think he would succeed, and that the Reagan administration had gone kind of too much into a romantic realm in thinking about how SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, could solve all of our problems. When Bush gives his first address to Congress, he says, we encourage Gorbachev's reforms. We need to see where it's going and how we can best respond to it. He's also a very proud person. All of these people have big egos. They want to be remembered not for Reagan's policies, but for Bush's policies. And one of the things they're thinking about a lot, and this gets back to Gorbachev's speech to the United Nations. I mean, Gorbachev, when he gave that speech, had said to his advisors, I want Yalta in reverse. And he meant in 1945, at the Yalta Conference at the end of World War II, Poland had been divided, and with it, Europe. And on Gorbachev's mind is a message of a freer and open and more unified Europe. And the Bush people start to think that way too. They're not yet prepared to act. Bush, in late February, orders a series of strategic reviews, and the plan is that he would roll them out during the commencement season in the United States at West Point and elsewhere. Events intervene. We'll hear a moment about what's going on in Poland. And the short of it is you have a roundtable process in Poland led by General Jaruzelski, who had 8 years earlier imposed martial law, but over time relaxed the type of oppression, authoritarianism that was there. And in April of '89, you're right on the cusp of an agreement that is going to recognize, legalize solidarity. And George Bush had given his word to Jaruzelski 2 years earlier. Even though your country has massive economic debts, if you pursue political reform, you will receive aid from the United States. And you can trust me because George Bush believed that his word was his bond. So literally 30 years ago, April 12th, 1989, Bush and his advisors are drafting the speech that he's going to give in Hamtramck, Michigan on April 17th. And it's a remarkable speech. And at this point, let me turn over to China and then return to Europe. You can stay if you don't need to.
So the story of China in 1989, the Chinese story of 1989 is a tragedy. It's a tragedy not just for those who perished in the conflicts or in the kind of Tiananmen protests and protests around the country, but it also is a tragedy in the sense that it reminds us that authoritarian regimes do not always collapse, do not always fail. It is primarily a domestic story. The Chinese kind of like survival of the regime's survival through the turbulence of 1989 is primarily a domestic story. It's a story of two Chinas, a rural China and an urban China. So I have a few kind of just basic slides, images to kind of portray this story, some of the characters, and so on. The protests spark it's not April 12th, it's April 15th, so I guess Monday. And the spark here is the death of Hu Yaobang, who is a former general secretary of the Communist Party, which is the best title to have in the country, but was actually still the number 2 official behind Deng Xiaoping in prominence and authority. He had been pushed aside 2 years before because of dissension about his response to earlier student protests. The tinder upon which this spark kind of like grew into a flame is a series of student movements that had happened in 1986, and actually prior nationalist movements in 1985. The party had seen a decline in party discipline, in party prestige, and in party prominence. That is, party members, Chinese Communist Party members, were no longer as kind of disciplined in terms of exacting and controlling the population. The party authority was no longer seen as prestigious as it had been, or as prominent. It was not everywhere where it had been previously. There had been a decline of the party's infiltration to economic and daily life. The regime's economic performance, that is the way that kind of people's incomes or daily lives, in general, China had been experiencing economic growth, but that economic growth is relatively uneven. So many urban workers kind of who continued to work for state-owned factories, if you look on objective terms, their economic situation seems to have been better in 1987 than in 1986, or in 1988 than 87. But there's a real unevenness to this. So the average is not necessarily the kind of universal. Not every boat was lifted. And so there was increasing dissension or frustration about the kind of a rising inequality inside of a society that still was led by a communist party and still kind of talked about itself in these communist terms. In particular, there had been dramatic inflation in 1986 to 1989 that really was eroding the purchasing power of a lot of particularly urban workers. So that's kind of the background for this. So after April 15th, this prominent leader who had been seen as relatively supportive of student protest or the acceptability of protest and dialogue inside of this authoritarian regime, he passed away. And kind of initial responses were around the country. You saw students in particular, but others as well, kind of going to prominent features, squares inside of cities, and laying wreaths to honor this former leader. And in Beijing in particular, but not just Beijing, these kind of protests or what these kind of memorials became kind of people speaking out, complaining about their grievances. So 3 thoughts about what is in this image and one that is not. So first, if this is so clearly the 80s. I don't know if I can give you a stronger, outside of Miami Vice, I don't know if I can give you a stronger image of the 1980s. And so I thank that gentleman for wearing the sunglasses, because it really does convey that this happened 30 years ago. So this is the image of Wang Dong, a leader of the movement, speaking primarily to foreign journalists. So, of course, China has its own domestic journalists, but they're not necessarily going to be writing a lot about the protests or listening to the protest leaders, although there is some dissension there as well. So the presence of foreign journalists, there are, of course, always foreign journalists in Beijing through most of this period under reform, but there is more foreign journalists because there is going to be Gorbachev is going to come to Beijing May 15th, and so it makes the protests kind of more internationally viewed rather than solely for domestic purposes. And so the third kind of idea from this image that I want to kind of make sure is conveyed is that that protests are discursive, that it is not simply people standing in a square silent, but that there is communication about kind of grievances, about complaints, about demands, about suggestions about what the citizens would like. What isn't on this slide, and I realized this after I kind of thought about, is that all of my slides are from Beijing. And that's the way we talk about the Tiananmen protest. Tiananmen is the square, the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing. But the movement actually is nationwide. It's urban, but it is nationwide. In dozens of cities, you have kind of major kind of groups and protests. In particular, in Chengdu, you will eventually see 8 citizens killed and 1,800 injured, and that's the official numbers. So I only have Beijing images, but it is important to remember this is a nationwide phenomenon. So a little over 2 weeks after that photo was taken, Tiananmen Square has become overrun with citizens in various groups declaring their allegiances to particular units of Beijing. So this is mostly university students, but also increasingly workers. And that particular combination of workers and students coming together is particularly dangerous to the regime, a regime that sees itself as both the vanguard, but a vanguard for the workers, right? So the vanguard, that is the students and the kind of the workers. And if both of those populations are resisting or are frustrated or are expressing grievances, that's particularly dangerous for a regime that ostensibly represents these individuals. So this is May 17th. Gorbachev had arrived 2 days earlier in Beijing, and the intent was for him to come and stay or kind of be introduced at the Great Hall of the People, which is adjacent to Tiananmen Square, but they had to scuttle that, and so instead it was held at the airport. During this time, there are already hundreds of students engaging in a hunger strike. So again, this is not just like a limited amount of frustration, kind of like we would like slightly different things. These are, some people at least are really engaged and really willing to put their lives on the line. 2 days after this image, Li Peng declares martial law in the city, but troops are blocked by residents and students from clearing the square. So now, jumping forward another 2 weeks, you can see now encampments, right? So here are tents and encampments. So this is increasingly becoming a permanent installation. The other thing to notice here is that this kind of hiding Mao in the background is what is referred to as the Goddess of Democracy statue. Behind is the actual gate to the Forbidden City, the Gate of Heavenly Peace that the square is named after. And so there are lots of debates about the extent to which we should think about the Tiananmen protests or the protests in 1989 in China as a democracy movement versus a kind of a protest movement asking for improved situations. The fact that there is a Goddess of Democracy statue suggests that we should not be totally dismissive of the idea that it is a democracy movement. But I do think that there is a real debate here. And so I'm not going to be able to go fully into that debate because the last time I checked, a bibliography of Chinese studies had around 60 books on the Tiananmen protest, and so I'm giving the shortest of kind of like summaries here. But this is an important discussion point: is to what extent were the protests, and certainly there's differences of opinion among the protesters. This is not a unified population by any means. the last image before, so this is the kind of on the day that the soldiers who are behind this dissident will clear the square and violently clear the square. And so this is just another image to say that this is a discussion and a debate. So this is a dissident trying to talk with the soldiers that will later that evening like kill his comrades, kind of use their vehicles to kind of overrun barricades, calling on them to go home, calling on them to see that they are the People's Liberation Army and we are the people, and to argue that this is not justified, this is not legitimate action. So in this case, he fails, this dissident fails. You can also see there are kind of like three sets of people. There are those who are calling on the soldiers not to act. There are the soldiers who are listening or ignoring his speech. And then there are by the hundreds, actually the largest population here, right, are the observers. And so I think this is also indicative of the nature of authoritarian kind of regimes and protests, that this kind of small set of individuals who are actually protesting can bring down a regime, depending in part on what the soldiers do and what the general population does. So the actual kind of protests and violence of June 4th, really beginning on the evening of June 3rd, there is real violence in the square. This is an APC kind of running over tents. There is real dissension and violence on the protesters against the military coming. Oh, I'm skipping ahead. This is an APC that has been kind of demolished or is in flames, a barricade that people had tried to set it up, and that there was real violence as the military cleared the square. Those killed would be symbols for dissidents of sacrifice to a noble cause, for future generations as an example to be feared or avoided, for the regime as a demonstration of its power, but also of its precarity. So finally, I end with this image, which is probably the most famous image of 1989 in China. Important to note that this is an after image. This is not something that the story had finished in many ways, in terms of the square had been cleared, and so the dramatic threat to the regime of the protest movement had been kind of eliminated, and yet that doesn't mean that the images like stop and the story doesn't stop. It is an arresting visual. For some, it is the story of a single hero standing up against the might and power of a militarized modern state. The final thing I'll end with, though, is that this image was also used by the state itself as a demonstration of its restraint. This is the Chinese state in its full power deciding generously in its mind to not run over an individual that would, of course, have no power to resist it. So it is finally a lesson in perspective that what some see as kind of obvious in its interpretation can be used in different ways by different individuals with different perspectives or different interests. So with that, I'll turn it over. We'll go back to the kind of less tragic story of Europe in 1989.
Okay. Try to look at my pictures and at you. So this is I had this idea that maybe I would kind of tell the story backwards. This is the sort of 89 that we like to think about, right? And that this is the image of the wall down, clearly a celebration. But, these questions about how is it that we got here, and I would echo both of the points. Jeremy's point about there is also a debate about how democratic we understand this revolution to have been. And also James's point that nobody sort of saw this coming, actually. I think anyone who said that they saw this coming was probably lying. The story, basically, of how we get there is that the wall ultimately gets torn down, and as we saw in the newsreel, it's kind of this tension, and I like both of these pictures because, they have the protesters at different stages, either on the sort of East German side of the wall, with the border guards in the no man's land looking at them, or, up on the top, on the left side, those guards. And I would stress that, the wall kind of comes down because nobody stops it from coming down. That's really, by this point already, the the East German state had allowed travel to the West. That had been a demand of the demonstrators, but they hadn't issued they didn't say it was okay to tear down the Berlin Wall. So the fact that this was possible really has a lot to do with the state forces and their responses. Moving backwards a little bit more, this kind of originates from these mass demonstrations here in East Berlin on Alexanderplatz in early November. That's 5 days before the wall is torn down. And that movement had really emerged out of these, there were a lot of popular movements in East Germany, but it had really emerged out of these protests in Leipzig, deeper in East Germany, that they had been doing every Monday, these Monday demonstrations. So it was like clockwork, and the state knew that these were going to happen. And again, we see the response of the state in that this one on October 9th in particular is noteworthy because for that one, about a week before it, there had sort of been a standing shoot-to-kill order, but about a week before that, Erich Honecker issued a shoot-to-kill order, and basically it wasn't carried out. And the fact that it wasn't carried out, again, you think about the role of the sort of state responses, the fact that it wasn't carried out, the next week, it was almost 120,000 people in Leipzig, and that's really the kind of how that happens. And if you don't know German, the signs really ask for reform. It says we demand free elections. This is maybe not necessarily a kind of full state revolution, but more demands for civil, kind of, I guess, what we would call a civil society. Pulling back more, some more pictures of these Monday demonstrations in Leipzig. But really, if you think about, the Monday demonstrations took place around this church, the St. Nicholas Church in Leipzig, I'm sort of going backwards because I'm trying to think about where the dissidence comes from. And a lot of this really begins around the church. And in fact, the church had been, from about 1979 until about 1984 in East Germany, the state had kind of acknowledged that the church would be a sort of official vent for dissidents. And in some ways, what emerges in the 80s is a critique that the church isn't allowing that to go far enough. But the church is still a place that kind of emerges. And what it is that emerges is an even longer story of thinking about peace activism, environmental activism, which really is a response to, and this emerges in West Germany as well, this response to, one, the ecological consequences of the rapid industrialization of Eastern Europe during the Cold War, but also the peace movement in protest of escalating nuclear tensions, especially when Reagan is elected. There's the largest public protest in German history, I think, certainly in West German history, is a peace protest against the stationing of Pershing II warheads in West Germany that NATO had actually agreed to, or West Germany had actually agreed to in the early 80s. But to kind of think about, the sort of thing I'll say about that is that even while all this is going on, to echo the point again, I don't think anyone really took seriously that this was going to end in the wall coming down, and certainly not in the reunification a year after that. In the early 1970s, the West German Chancellor Willy Brandt had sort of marked himself as a very, he was very famous for accepting Cold War borders. So before him, the East and West German states in their constitution formally said that they sought reunification through their own state. And they also contested the border zone with Poland. We heard a little bit about that before, that after the Second World War, the western part of Poland was on land that before the war was the eastern part of Germany. So Willy Brandt, he said, I'll acknowledge these borders, and that allowed the stabilization of East-West relations in the 70s and in the 80s. In 1974, East and West Germany exchanged diplomats for the first time. In many ways, things are more stable than they had ever been. And so the point is to kind of think about, dissidence as a kind of critique of something, maybe not a critique of an entire state, that in the German case at least, consolidates in this particular moment and then comes to a head when the state basically does nothing. In the Polish case, so this is Wałęsa on the left. He's the head of Solidarność, the Solidarity movement. And this is sort of where we end. In June, Solidarity wins an electoral landslide. They win 99 out of 100 seats in the Polish Senate. And what it is it's basically a group that had forced these roundtable talks by going on strike. It's basically a trade union. And interestingly enough, the day, and I think when we come back around to Tiananmen, we can think about this, the day of this election is the day that the Chinese government cracks down on the Tiananmen Square protest. So it's kind of this moment. But to get there, there is this moment where the opposition, this labor union that turned into a party, sat down and had a conversation with the heads of the Polish state. This is him again, Wałęsa. This is a demonstration which is a part of the strike in late 1988, which led to the roundtable conversation and then ultimately the roundtable agreement, which created the election. Going back even further to think about the origins of this, Solidarity actually emerges out of a shipbuilder strike at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk in 1980. And James also mentioned this. This is the moment where the Polish state declares martial law. They suppress this workers' strike. They put Wałęsa and the rest of the leaders of Solidarity in prison until 1983. And the other kind of point, again, to think about religion, is that the Pope at this time, Pope John Paul II, was Polish. And for Poland, Catholicism is a really important part of their cultural identity, especially because they think of themselves as sort of being on the frontier of an Eastern Orthodox empire, basically. So this connection of religion, of popularizing Polish pride, I don't know if I would call it nationalism at this point, coinciding with a critique coming from somewhere other, coming from workers themselves. And similar in the case of China, I think, is that, these are workers critiquing a workers' state, right? And so I think that is a kind of an interesting kind of tension when you want to think about where it is that dissent comes from. I would only say that the similar things are happening in Hungary, and it's in Hungary and Poland that Gorbachev decides to do nothing. And that really is a radical break in terms of understanding what goes on in Europe. In 53 and 56, Khrushchev had put down protests in Berlin and Budapest. In 68, Brezhnev put down one in Prague. So mass demonstrations aren't enough. There had been those before. The role of the state, and Gorbachev is pretty clear that he's not going to sort of intervene in these, is really an important step, I think, in terms of explaining where we get to. Should I stop there for?
Is that okay?
Yeah,
great. Thank you. That was a great kind of opening to the discussion. I want to pick up on Robert's point and Jeremy's point and turn to James. How does the United States and the Soviet Union, in this case Gorbachev, so Jeremy had mentioned that one of the issues around Tiananmen was that, and the press coverage was because Gorbachev was there on a state visit. And I'm curious how they viewed both China and then Eastern Europe and the situation of these rising protests and dissident movements in light of the crackdown in Tiananmen, James. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think it's on both tracks, and it is remarkable how they all connect, right? That the press is there because Gorbachev is coming. They see the protests, and then when Gorbachev goes back home, they stay to, so the images are coming in to the rest of the world of what's going on in Tiananmen Square. Bush feels is kind of torn because he's being pilloried domestically by Congress and by critics in the press for not taking a vehement enough stand against the Chinese government. He also feels that he has these personal connections with Deng Xiaoping, who stopped responding to him for a few days, and is very upset by something that Bush said publicly, that he thought that he's being criticized for being at home for being too mild, but Deng Xiaoping thought it was a kind of grave insult to him. And so he sends Brent Scowcroft and Deputy Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger on a very sort of sensitive mission to kind of reach out to the government. But I think in terms of then what is going on in Hungary and Poland and East Germany, Bush is very wary of having a repetition of what happened in June in Tiananmen Square. And when he goes to Hungary and meets with some of the, so-called dissident groups, he's underwhelmed by them and concerned that these aren't necessarily the groups we want to be pushing for. He would rather deal with the forces in power and nudging them to be a bit more moderate. So again, less revolution, more creating a civil society. In terms of Gorbachev, it's slightly tinged by a kind of, I don't know how the right word to use, whether it's a kind of racial thing. He often says to his advisors, we can't be like these people in China, right? We're Europeans is the term he uses. And he's like, maybe there are some governments here, and he mentions Ceausescu in the context of how he might respond. But there's a kind of sense of pride that those people. Those are other types of people. We're different, and that doesn't sound very nice. But the kernel of it is that he did want to react in ways differently than what he saw in the images that he saw from June of 1989. And I would also just close by saying that just reiterating the point that he views Poland, Germany, and Hungary and the memory of previous protests. I mean, the other language that he's using is basically giving the okay to commemorate Imre Nagy in Hungary, to allow people to say, well, maybe 1968 in Prague was the start of something. He kind of, by not saying anything, he lets them go forward. But I just want to say that that's still different than the way he's looking at the potential problems within the Soviet Union, within Russia and its traditional empire.
Thank you. So, Robert, building on that, one of the things I really liked about your presentation was you mentioned 1980 and the strike. And there's, some information based on the discussions within the Politburo that Andropov says, because he's being pushed to intervene, and he says the quote has been exhausted of our interventions. They're going to have to sort it out. And I'm curious, right, how East Germany and West Germany viewed Tiananmen in light of this, and viewed the situation, as well as, to your point, Honecker gives an order, it's not followed, right, which is remarkable, right, especially considering his role in East Germany. How are they viewing these events unfolding, and both with Gorbachev's lack of response as well as this harsh response in China within the Germans?
Yeah. it's so I actually so first of all, to kind of pick up this from the international perspective, Gorbachev makes it really clear that he's not going to sort of follow this, and there's these really interesting interactions between him and Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of West Germany at the time, talking about. They don't specifically mention Tiananmen, but it's clear that that's what they're talking about. And they talk about what's going on in Poland, what's going on in Hungary, what's going on in East Germany. And it's clear that Helmut Kohl is trying to basically encourage Gorbachev to continue to let things go as they are. And popularly so that's sort of the West German official response, I guess. Popularly, it fuels a lot of these peace protests. It galvanizes a lot of support, especially for nonviolent protest, which is also the story in East Germany. The Tiananmen crackdown really encourages this idea of nonviolent protest, which had grown out of these Helsinki Accords in the 70s, where all these countries had signed on to respect human rights and things like that. So dissident groups begin to point to that and say, look, you're signed on to this international agreement to respect human rights, and we're just peacefully demonstrating and asking you to hold up to that. Honecker is, really out on his own there. He, in fact, so this Monday demonstration in October that I talked about, where he had issued this shoot-to-kill order, Gorbachev comes on October 7th, 2 days before that, and basically says, we're not going to back you up on this, and I highly urge you to be moderate. And Honecker really kind of loses it and starts saying that the Soviet Union is now subversive, and he has some pretty radical rhetoric about this. For him, Tiananmen was kind of he thought this was great, actually, that this is the way that a state should respond to this kind of protest. So they had some pretty different reactions. In the rest of Eastern Europe, I would say, the Polish elections already were the day of the Tiananmen crackdown. In Hungary, they had dismantled the border fence with Austria already in March. So there it didn't matter as much. It did matter a lot in Czechoslovakia, and I didn't talk about these pictures, but I'd have one from Prague, so it's worth putting up there just so we can look at it. In Prague, what ultimately happens very quickly, and it's all done under in the name of nonviolence, and that really is a conviction for most of the Czechoslovakian dissidents after Tiananmen Square, especially also.
Great. Jeremy, I love two of the points you made. One was the restraint from the tank man picture, right? I think that's remarkable, but it really ties into the symposium, so I'm so glad you made it. But one of the things I'm curious about, and the second point being that these were nationwide protests. So how much after the crackdown, and then how long does it take to suppress around the nation, or is it simultaneous? And how much is Deng Xiaoping and the leadership looking at what's occurring in Eastern Europe, as well as, to James's point, he's annoyed with the Bush administration, or are they just too focused internally to really be concerned about kind of what's going on? Or are they seeing these signs? I mean, to Robert's point, Honecker looks at Tiananmen and thinks, why aren't we doing this, right? I mean, so I'm curious how this unfolds over the next few months and into, especially once we get to the fall, and the collapse of the Berlin Wall.
So I think the protesters around China did not see the actual kind of like crushing of the protests in Beijing as restraint. And so if you were sitting in a square in Chengdu or in Shanghai and protesting, calling for reforms, calling for changes, you did not see that violence and the declaration of martial law and then the clearing of the square as anything other than what would happen to you as well. And so I think it is not as if there was a simultaneous nationwide kind of movement on all of the squares at the same time, because at some level, if you do it once, it's clear that you are willing to do this in the most prominent situation, then the regime would be likely to issue the order in other kind of less prominent locales where there's not as much international media. So I think there are crackdowns in other cities where the protesters are not leaving. At the actual timing, I don't know if it's all, if some of them proceed, if there's some that happen on June 1st or some happen on June 6th. It is quite quickly kind of resolved in that sense. The extent to which Beijing is thinking, or the leaders in Beijing are thinking about what is happening in the rest of the world, I don't think that they are prepared to have elections. No one is calling like the Polish case for elections. The students of Beijing University are showing up and asking for kind of like better meals in the cafeteria. They're calling for like slight improvements or adjustments of wages. I mean, very, very low-level demands. It becomes dangerous for the regime because there are divisions inside and because you get so many people, but there is not the strong call for real radical kind of systemic reforms. So I don't think there's anything that dangerous. I do think that the kind of like the regime is clear that it has done this, that it is like successful, and that it is proud of what it has done. For I think the year afterwards, the national high school or the national college entrance exam that all students have to take in order to get into college, there's always a component that is about history and political history, and you have to know the quote unquote right answers. And for a year or so, there is questions about the protest and how it was correct that the government cracked down. Afterwards, it disappears and it's just not discussed. And so that's basically the world that we're in now. 89 is a verboten topic. It's deleted or censored. But for a moment there, it is something that is kind of talked about to make sure that everyone got the point. One thing I will say is that there's some scholarship that kind of tries to compare the kind of Chinese situation and the European situations, and looking at the amount of information that the regime had. And I think this is part of the story that the regime told itself in China, was that these are a very small set of people. Of course, yes, there's a lot of people in the square, but China is a huge population. It's still, the vast majority of people are in the countryside, and the countryside is with us. These urbanites are just, they're radical elements. They're infiltrated by the West. The extent to which that is the case is still unclear. But the story that the regime told was that it thought that it had the people's support. Whereas in the European cases, there is much better information collection about the extent to which popular support for the regime, or there's kind of complaints or grievances about the regime, are kind of known by those outside of Honecker, who I think is determined to kind of respond strongly and is unwilling to concede. But this idea that the regime is able to give the order and convince its soldiers to actually carry out the orders, in part because it does truly believe that it is popular, and it doesn't have disconfirming information to that.
And this is often a common theme within authoritarian regimes, is that there's in some cases, the overestimation of their own popularity, and in some cases, it may be the reality. I think one of the things that you both pointed out that's really important is the idea that these are, in the case of Poland, workers' movements that are challenging the state of the workers. And in the case of China, a very similar issue that's raised to the army. You're supposed to be the People's Liberation Army, or that these are workers and students who are making these demands. So I think it's really important points to make. Jeremy, you touched on this about how spring of '89 it has a brief moment of being viewed in China, and it's more of, again, tying into the authoritarian aspect of it, which is, do you know the right answer to this question, right? So I'm curious if we can take that to look at some of the other countries we viewed. How is spring of '89 viewed now as we think about the transition from the Soviet Union to Russia, and then, of course, Robert, you're dealing with a lot, but as we can actually turn to you first, because let's talk about the Germanys, right? Yeah. And then let's shift.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of a complicated memory, actually. On the one hand, I mean, I would say the wall itself, right, has become this kind of symbol of imposed division. And the tearing down of it is seen as kind of this the rise of the people. And I think that that's created this kind of the democratic mythology and memory that we maybe opened with. And to a certain extent that's true, and I think a lot of people do still feel that way, that this was a sort of rise of the people. But, on the other hand, it also created really complicated legacies for former East and former West Germans after reunification also, because basically what happens is West Germany just kind of takes over East Germany. The East German state ceases to exist, and the constitution, the political structures of the former West Germany become just there's a kind of continuity there. And for many people, former East Germans, that's really hard to deal with. And many of them, I think, feel like that they were just caught up in that and wrapped up in that. And there's a kind of interesting nostalgia that's going on in former East Germany, and really in most post-communist countries of Europe, with the exception actually of the Czech Republic and Slovakia, which is a super interesting phenomenon. That's the one place that they don't really seem to care much about the communist past. But basically everywhere else, there's this kind of nostalgia. And in East Germany, there was a survey in 2009 that 57% of former East Germans, how did they phrase it? The survey said that the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, was more good than bad. So 57% in 2009 still. And so that's, pretty remarkable actually. And I can talk a little bit about the East European case maybe in a minute as we get towards thinking about where we are today, because I think that memory actually really matters. But I would say also there's a kind of foreign, the fall of the Berlin Wall has become a kind of global symbol of the rise of the people against authoritarianism, right? I mean, there are sections of it that still stand in Berlin, but there are also segments of it that have been shipped all over the world. There's one in LA, I think there's one in DC, and they're sort of everywhere. So the fall of the Berlin Wall in particular has become this kind of global memory of a democratic uprising of the people. And I think it's a little more complicated than that. But the idea that Reagan says tear down this wall and then he tore down the wall is not exactly how it works. And I watched this really funny clip of David Hasselhoff, he played at the Berlin Wall in 1989, and then he came back and played again in 90, and he said, everyone just, and the interview was just from a couple years ago, and he still has this memory that, that it's because of him that the Berlin Wall came down. And so I think everybody tries to kind of claim this as a celebration of a really honest, liberal, universal democratic people. Right?
That's a great transition to James, because there is this debate between the Reagan team and the Bush team as to who's really responsible. But there's another superpower summit. I mean, connecting back to Governor's Island, how we started, after the Berlin Wall comes down, in which Gorbachev has to now meet with the Bush administration, and it's a very different than how he opened. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Right, and let me just add quickly that there's pieces of the Berlin Wall at the Museum of Science and Technology just on the other side of town. So even in Syracuse, as I found yesterday, we have pieces of the wall. So the Bush and Gorbachev meet off the coast of Malta in December of 1990. It's always fun deciding where to meet, because you're supposed to go one to Washington, then to either the U.S. or the Soviet Union. But what counts as a summit? It gets very confusing. So they meet off of this tanker, and I think that there's two things that come from this, right? That Bush sees his role with Gorbachev is as to try to allay his concerns about the possible consequences of the collapse of power in Central and Eastern Europe. And Bush does that very well from that moment onward. Helmut Kohl has just given this speech calling for the laying out different points that would determine German unification. And Gorbachev is very upset about this, that he's moving too quickly, he's moving too fast. And Bush and his team start to come up with ways of getting Gorbachev and Shevardnadze on board to the prospect of a reunified Germany within NATO. Secondly, what comes out of this summit in Malta is the sense among Bush and his advisors, including his Secretary of State, Jim Baker, who had been Secretary of Treasury, that Gorbachev really does not have a firm grasp on the economics of his country, and he does not know what to do, and they don't know what to do either. But it's the start of a process where they start harnessing what they consider to be the top U.S. experts, whether it's Jeffrey Sachs or whoever, and in good faith trying to send over these kind of delegations to try to assist the Soviet economy. Should I think a moment about how it's remembered? I mean, the memory of the spring of '89 in Russia today, I think it's hard to isolate it just to a particular period, right? The person who has a clear memory of the fall of '89 is, of course, Vladimir Putin, who, while working for the KGB, was working in a Stasi facility, and in early interviews, I mean, he used the term, "Moscow was silent, nobody lifted a finger to protect us," in November of 1989. So for Putin, there was a kind of humiliation and physical danger that these institutions that he had thrived in, he had believed in, all evaporated under his feet. And I would say that that's actually not the broader memory. The broader memory is everything that happened in '89 is okay, where things really started to go wrong in terms of the status of Russia in the world was in the aftermath of '90 and '91. I mean, Germany unified in NATO. If Gorbachev had been a bit firmer in the spring of 1990 and said, okay, if you want this, it has to be Germany in the French model, which is outside the kind of military structures. And if he had said that and he had pushed for it, I mean, what we heard, Robert was talking earlier about the protest movements. I mean, if the hinge of German unification came down to nuclear weapons in Germany, or whether it adopts the full structures of NATO, I mean, a firmer Russian leader could have gotten away with that. And you could have had Germany in the France model, and the Bush people were terrified of that. But it's, the sense that we're getting taken advantage of in '90 and '91. And then even from Gorbachev's perspective, he had no problem seeing Eastern European empire go. It was the sense that in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and then even in Ukraine, that he could have preserved the Union, and that was not the fault of the United States. From his perspective, that was the fault of Boris Yeltsin, who kept coming back and undermining him and ultimately triumphed over Gorbachev.
No, that's great. And it's a transmission to Jeremy, if I could. So James makes the point that, Putin looks at this as this humiliation, and even though that's not the overriding view, are there some important lessons from '89 that have been forgotten or overlooked that should not have been from your perspective, at least from the perspective of China, and that we can apply more broadly as we think about revisiting this period?
So I'll take this from the regime's point of view first, and then kind of maybe my point of view, which are distinct in this case, as they are often. The Chinese regime has systematically studied 1989, its own response to Tiananmen, but even more, I would argue, they have studied the ways in which European communist states fell. in order to try to avoid that similar fate. And so they have tried to look at the economic situation, who was actually protesting, political orders. They have done their best to really try to understand all of this. And so they have put actual social scientists trying to think about these things, actual historians trying to reconstruct records. The extent to which that kind of complicated, sophisticated analysis is actually what the top leadership takes, I think, is not very strong, because when Xi Jinping himself talks about why those regimes fell, he says his explanation is that no one was man enough to stand up for the regime. And it is this very gendered, like, man, like we need a, like, and it is like, perhaps from that alone, we should have been able to predict more about the direction that Xi Jinping has taken his country in the past 7 years under his reign. But this idea that that strong, by which he means violent response to resistance, is absolutely acceptable. The Chinese regime did reorganize some of its security apparatus, in particular the creation of the People's Armed Police, in order to separate, so the military that trains itself thinking about foreign enemies is not necessarily going to be the same people that are going to put down protests. To have individuals who are trained and to like think of their job and their training along those lines is one of the kind of consequences for the regime. So I think that's the way that the regime thinks about 1989. I think the way that the lessons for 89 for scholarship, I think that one is that there are, even though I think the Chinese story is primarily a domestic story, especially the European cases, there really is a lot of interconnection, a lot of transmission of information across borders, and so an internationalization of these analyses, something that my discipline sometimes forgets about, is the fact that a lot of information can cross borders. And so I think that treating it as a individual event as opposed to a wave, I think we can really make some real treating this as a wave, which I think it is a reality, is that individuals are observing each other's, what is happening, state responses, dissident responses or protester responses, and back and forth. History continues, and we do see kind of what is going on, so that would the Chinese response have been different if they had seen the right? If the timing were slightly different in some ways, would they have been even more violent or even more aggressive in their response, or would they have backed down? These types of kind of like counterfactuals are always really interesting. I do think that things could have turned out differently in the Chinese case. It could have absolutely moved in a very different direction, where you do see kind of movement towards to not crack down, to allow the protests to. So there is a contingency to political reality that is not necessarily always going to be fixed in a particular direction. The inevitability, and maybe that's where I'll end, that the fact that the Chinese regime persists for 30 years after 1989 does not mean that it had to persist through 89, that if we run that history 30 times, certainly one of those or two of those or maybe even 10 of those times, we see a very different political regime emerging. So similarly, the fact that most of those regimes in Eastern Europe and the communist regime in the Soviet Union, and that it collapses, that it ends afterwards, everyone predicted, right? It's overdetermined. Of course the regime was going to collapse, but the fact that we didn't know it beforehand and that it surprised us going in, surprised the leaders themselves, I think should, if nothing else, just caution us to be humble about our study of authoritarian regimes, that it is difficult to know what is going on. Citizens don't know what to expect. Regimes don't know what to expect. Other governments don't know what to do and what can be helpful or unhelpful. I think these are all lessons that we should take, and that I think that often a lot of sophisticated regimes have taken. I don't know if the Chinese is the best example there, or at least its particular leader at the moment. But so those are all lessons that I would take from the 1989 case.
I think that so in terms of just the actual events and what we can take from those, I think that I talked a lot about where the dissidents came from, thinking about pre-existing movements as well as other sites of opposition, so religion, environmentalism, peace movement. I think the point there is that you never really know where successful dissidence is going to come from, so you just pick a cause and go for it. But also I think the issue of the state, you also never really know how a state is going to react. And interesting in that, I already talked about the state and the use of violence, but one of the things I didn't get to talk about much is that a lot of the revolutions of '89, they took shape the way they did because of how the respective states responded to the recessions of the 70s and 80s. So for example, in Poland, their response was to raise commodity prices, and this is why the workers went on strike. In Romania, the state response was basically forced rationing, and that created a lot of resentment, which ended why Romania ended as violently as it did. So the lesson there, I think, is that it's really important to pay attention to how states respond to recession, and I think that helps us maybe think about where we are now also, because that's, should I sort of hold on this, or do you want me to? Okay, so in terms of where we are in Europe now, there is a rise of sort of populist, arguably authoritarian, especially in Hungary and Poland. And in both cases, the leaders, the Kaczynskis, well, one of them has passed away in Poland, but also Viktor Orban in Hungary, they all have sort of publicly spoken that '89 was not a revolution. And in some ways, it wasn't. Orban was one of the founding members of Fidesz, which is has a supermajority in the Hungarian parliament right now. It has the ability to change the constitution. It was founded as an opposition movement in the late 80s, and it's one of the major dissident forces that was behind the revolution of '89. And he really, flipped the way he did because of the recession in '08. This is the guy who oversaw Hungarian entrance into NATO, into the EU. He's now Eurosceptic, anti-immigrant, populist nationalist, right? And has a supermajority and the ability to change the constitution. So that's disconcerting if you think about the way that states react to recession. I think is a crucial part of the lessons to take. The other one, and this I think maybe gets us back to this issue of if this was a democratic sort of surge of the people, which in many ways it was, and it certainly has been remembered that way. The kind of dark side of that is that most of the states in Eastern Europe now, Poland, Hungary, even in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, this radical right populist party, and I think you could say the same about the US, about Russia, about many places, a lot of what we're seeing now uses the language of the people. And it says, we are gonna do what Orban calls illiberal democracy, which is basically, we will govern in the name of the people because they have spoken and we know what's in their best interest and we don't actually have to be democratic about it. And I think that is a really scary kind of legacy of thinking about the people and who they are and who represents the people, especially, so I had this, I was gonna read it, but I won't read it. Just know if you read it, there's a sentence in there which is almost a whole paragraph, so just pace yourself. But basically, Václav Havel was the sort of intellectual of Eastern European descent, right? He wrote this Power of the Powerless, which became a kind of standard reading for East European dissidents, and still is. But I really like it, especially at the end, because he says, it's really not all that important whether by accident of domicile we confront a Western manager or an Eastern bureaucrat in this very modest and yet globally crucial struggle against the momentum of impersonal power. And I think that idea of how do we actually reinsert individuals when everyone's already talking about the people, And what is the difference between those? I think that's a space that 89 helps us open up in really interesting ways.
Great, thank you. James, do you want to talk a little about lessons for Washington that perhaps...
Good lessons or bad lessons? I realize I neglected to say up front what I'm supposed to say every time, which is my views do not necessarily reflect those of the government. I think that there's a sense, I'm trying to figure out how to articulate this. I would say that roughly 90% of national security figures who played a role at a kind of deputy, assistant secretary level and above in any administration going back to the late 80s, that in the 2016 election, they openly endorsed one candidate, or at least denounced the candidate who won. And I think that there are many reasons for this we don't have to get into, but one reason is a sense among a lot of people, a lot of Americans, that we did not get what we hoped with the end of the Cold War. And I think this period from 89 to 91, 92 really needs to be thought more. People need to think about it. People, undergraduates who are going to go on to fill the ranks of roles that require firm understanding, particularly in the global era of what has built the world we have here. And so, for instance, when George Bush, after signing the START 1 agreement in the summer of 1991, stops in Ukraine on the way home and warns of suicidal nationalism that he said is not the same thing as pursuing the advancement of democratic rights. That phrase haunts him throughout the 1990s. I mean, it becomes a kind of a go-to phrase of what not to say and how not to think in terms of U.S. foreign policy. And, you know, they look pretty good now, the sentiment. And it looks better in terms of what we know did happen in the 1990s in Yugoslavia, and the idea of having a Yugoslavia with nukes. Why didn't that happen in the Soviet Union? Well, part of it was the incredible work of the US and Soviet negotiators to denuclearize large part, to get Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus onto the START Treaty, to provide economic assistance and jobs for Soviet nuclear scientists who were being courted by Gaddafi in Libya and elsewhere. And so a lot of really important work went on behind the scenes. But what was remembered often was this rhetoric where it looks better today than it was at the time. And I also think, I'll just close by his point about 91, 92. I do think that if you look at the criticisms of George Bush in 1992 on the campaign trail, a lot of the tropes that come back in whatever form you want to call it in Donald Trump, a lot of the language is kind of there on the sidelines, whether it's Perot or Pat Buchanan, or even sometimes some things that Bill Clinton is saying on the campaign trail in 1992. And so I do think that it's a long way of saying that I would say that there's a broad sense of missed opportunities coming out of this exciting and hopeful and optimistic period of 1989.
Well, thank you. This was really enjoyable for me. I mean, I hope the audience enjoyed it. We're going to have a few minutes for Q&A, and we could actually talk for another 4 hours, I think, just between us. But this was fascinating. So do we have questions?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Terry? Okay.
Thanks. Thanks very much. I'm struck, as I think we all are, by the similarities of these movements, on different sides of the world, in the way in which they're inspired, in the first instance, by economics, inflation, dislocation, inequality, and the way, a sense of, popular movement, underlies all this. But I guess I'm still left wondering why we have such dramatically different outcomes. And, you've all mentioned the different elements. One is leadership, the decisive role that leadership plays. Another, which Jeremy alluded to in talking about George Bush's reaction, and other things, is political culture. The sense that in China there was no tradition, of democracy and reform. You've talked about the role of religion in Eastern Europe, which doesn't play the same role. We've talked about students in China versus labor leaders, in Eastern Europe. But I'm wondering if you have further thoughts, if we could drill a little bit deeper on why we see such dramatically different outcomes, the failure, if you will, of one movement and the success of the other. Thanks.
I can, I don't have an answer.
That's why I wanted you to go.
I don't think there is an answer. I think there are a plethora of answers. And so I think there is a fundamental difference. The fundamental difference in the end is which regimes were willing to give the order to fire or to dismiss populations, and under which circumstances were those orders followed, and kind of like that's the game. The question of why leaders and military officers, and then in the end soldiers who are actually pulling the trigger or kind of moving their APCs over the people, that's a deep question about those individuals and their organizations. I think the argument that I'm persuaded by is that I think that the Chinese regime really did believe that this was not representative of the population, and that they believed that the vast majority of the population were very supportive of their efforts and their continued rule. Although again, there's dissension within the very elites themselves, right? And so I think that the Chinese leadership in the end, those who make the decisions, Deng Xiaoping and others, firmly believe in their own purpose and are willing to give the order, and that order is eventually, after a couple of weeks, carried out. I think the European states, and I'll turn it over, I think I think they're either unwilling to give the order, or the order is not carried out, or there is more cynicism about their own leadership and the relationship between the population, or the attitudes of the population towards those states. But I am now kind of moving past my own expertise, so I will turn off the...
Yeah, well, I think the question is about degrees of success, and by success you mean the crumbling of a communist state, or... Because I think, in many ways, what we're seeing in places like Poland and Hungary right now is similar to what we're seeing in Russia, which is essentially state capitalism, which is not really all that different from what had come before in some ways. I mean, it's still, Orban in Hungary has sort of pointed to the, he has nationalized what had been privatized, a lot of industries. And so I think in some cases, the point is actually that, well, I guess my point is that I don't know, I think it's important that we think about what we mean by success, I guess. But the other thing I would say, and this is related, and I think it explains a lot of what happens in the 90s and into today, is that in most of these cases, in Poland, in Hungary, what happens is there's an opposition movement which sits down to a roundtable talk with the powers that be, which in those cases is the ruling Communist Party. And, if the dissident movements had been openly sort of fundamentally hostile to the communist state, those negotiations would not have happened. The regime would have put it down. And I think, in some cases, I think some of the recent scholarship about this talks about these as negotiated revolutions, and that that's a really important piece of this. And so the Polish Communist Party only sits down to these roundtable talks because they think that when the opposition doesn't do any better handling this recession, the people will critique the opposition and we can reconsolidate our power. And so I think the issue of who is actually in power and how we define success, to me, I guess is, I don't know if that's satisfying. I don't have an answer either, but I think that it's a really, in terms of thinking about what actually changed in '89, I think it's a useful way to think about it.
I think it's hard to overstate the importance of the personality and the humanity of Mikhail Gorbachev, that he cared what the world thought of him, he cared what his wife thought of him, he cared about his relationships with these other leaders, whether it's Thatcher or Bush or Kohl. He did not want to be excluded from the club. It weighed on him, the experience, Soviet experience in Afghanistan, experience of his predecessors. And he also he had a sense of the world moving forward, and specifically a sense of a Europe undergoing a type of unification to address challenges such as the global environmental degradation. Now, he thought that, he wanted to kind of lead in these movements, but if you look at what they were, those were the types of large organizing ideas that were supposed to then keep nationalism at bay in Europe. And for the most part, they do, in most of Europe. And it's really, as was said, the 2007, 2008 financial crisis that has kind of knocked everything out of its orbit. And one of the challenges then we face today, which is unlike the late Cold War, you don't have the institutional strength of international labor in 2019. You don't have the same type of moral clout that you did with the Catholic Church and Pope John Paul in the 1980s and coming out of Poland, who really, these institutions had big roles in terms of the political development of these countries we're talking about.
Well, that was great. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you. Thanks for coming.